Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome back to the day 2 afternoon section. So I hope you enjoy your quick lunch. This year we have a shorter lunch break as we hear your voice last year's. So hopefully you can enjoy the talk during your lunch as well. Okay, so in the afternoon section, we are happy to have Jeremy. So he is the product management lead API at Docusign. So I believe some of you should also have used Docusign before. So let's hear from him to talk about how API for scaling enterprise and setting the API standards. So can you hear me well?
Can you hear you?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, your voice is loud and clear. So I pass the stage to
Okay.
you. So thanks for your time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Patrick, and thank you all. How do you still ensure that solid developer experience? And what are the latest and greatest tools that make this easier through automation? First, I'm going to just go through my most hated slide of any presentation I give with API Days, and that's where I have to talk about myself, but you already got the basic intro. I'm currently working at Docusign. I'm part of the developer experience team, one of many folk who are working on APIs here at Docusign. In the past, I've worked at Box, that's what I'm most well known for, but also Tradeshift. That's the other billion-dollar company I'm allowed to talk about. I was early at these companies and helped them to really get their APIs going. So I've seen API initiatives in many places, in enterprise software, in education software, even in drones in the space industry as a consultant. I've also been an advisor to many startups through the Salesforce Accelerator, Alchemist Accelerator, and HeavyBit. So I've worked with many companies on getting their APIs launched. I've worked with many companies they've integrated with other platforms. And I watch companies grow and struggle, grow and succeed with their APIs, and then have challenges as they get to the next stage when they're really expanding and having many teams build out many APIs. That's what I want to get to today. But first, I have to set a little bit of base context for the principles of API design that I want to apply and the tools around that. Although we are focused today, again, more on API governance and API standardization at a larger enterprise. But I first have to make sure we're on the same page on like the basic principles of designing an API. And what I like to highlight here is how, really thanks to the magic of the Open API schema and surrounding initiatives, it really is much easier than it used to be to design, build, and launch APIs with a solid developer experience. Tools built around the Open API allow you to auto-generate your documentation, have a mock server, have API libraries and auto-generated code samples, even helps with API monitoring. And with all these tools around Open API, it's certainly much easier to provide a good developer experience. But it's also easier to even build APIs. One of the first tools that came out with the Open API and Swagger before that was the means of actually auto-generating an Open API schema off of a database schema and basically auto-generate a REST API off of your database. Now, I'm one who advocates the use of all these tools, but still a different approach to automation when it comes to API designs. This isn't about auto-generating APIs from a database, but using these tools for what many of us know as design first principles for APIs, or as I also like to say, applying the product management process to APIs. That's basically establishing the points of value for your platform first. Is this about growth? Is this about retention? Are you providing a feature benefit to partners? Are you enabling partners to enhance your functionality? And then from there, figuring out what are the kind of apps you really expect to be built with your APIs. Once you establish that, actually planning the APIs, designing the APIs that make it as easy as possible for your developer community to actually build those sort of apps that you expect. So there's a process here of understanding your developers, understanding their use cases, and then designing according to those use cases. And the tools around Open API today help to automate this process as well. We have the IDEs, Open API editors, to help you design your API and test those designs before you build your APIs at all. And then when you're ready to launch, have that auto-generated documentation, but also an API gateway that helps you to with implementation helps with post-launch monitoring. So there's tooling around this to automate the design-first APIs. And I really emphasize the importance of design-first APIs in enabling then higher quality APIs that are going to achieve that real product market fit, where you have that successful community of developers who are excited to use your APIs. But today we're going to talk about the next challenge. Let's say you have well-designed APIs and a really nice process of getting more APIs to market, all of which are a good fit for your developers. But then you've expanded. You have multiple teams building APIs. What happens then? Well, even if you're applying these great design principles, those design-first principles to your APIs, you're still going to run into this challenge of API consistency. Individual teams may launch high-quality APIs all at the same high quality with that product market fit, that design-first mentality, but those APIs won't naturally work together. And then as a developer, if I start building with one set of your APIs, but then I want to work with APIs from another product you've recently launched, I'm going to find differences in the way I have to authenticate, the scopes and permissions, or I'll find that the responses of some APIs are just a little bit different from what I'm expecting in another set of APIs. But then that means that I can't just take the output of one API and use as the input for another API. Data transformation then becomes necessary. And so my code is going to be much longer. There's going to be much more code. It's going to be more convoluted. It's going to be more error prone. So this is where we see that designing APIs for scale, it requires more than just designing APIs for good usability. So what do you do to avoid the situation where APIs, no matter how good, well-designed, well-intended the teams are, they will start to get naturally disjointed? This problem's been around for well over a decade. I have seen larger tech companies like Google take this on. Years ago, I got to work with Google Workspace, then Google Apps, and I watched how when connecting Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides, they actually had different ways of interacting with their documents. This is because the Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides were actually a consequence of 3 different acquisitions. There were 3 separate startups that Google acquired, and initially their APIs were actually very different. But the Google Workspace team figured out how to create a layer and establish better consistency across that product line. And Google in general started to work on a better solution for how to get all of their teams to have a more consistent API experience. And in recent years, this problem has become more prevalent. Basically, we've seen this surge around the same time that COVID started, where many billion-dollar tech companies had suddenly become $10 billion tech companies. And yes, this market graph is a few months old. Many of those tech companies dipped dramatically since then. Hey, I'm at one of them. Docusign did very well, and our APIs are doing great. But yeah, we have had this challenge with the market. But regardless of the market, we still have gone from being small companies with one team building APIs to a larger company with multiple teams working on APIs for different products. And this has really exacerbated in the last 3 years, where many, many tech companies are running into this challenge. And so the challenge has gone beyond just designing APIs well. It's about API consistency and establishing a standard within your company for everyone to use. So how do we get to establishing that standard? It really is easier said than done. In practice, I've learned that you can't just have one team defining the APIs and basically defining the APIs for all the other teams, saying we are now defining the APIs for all our products. You need a means by which each of these teams has the autonomy to plan their own APIs, but to still have those APIs aligned with all the other APIs at the company. This basically requires first getting some sort of standard that each team can use. This way the teams can plan their own API, but you can make sure that they're actually building them to a basic set of rules to make our APIs look similar. Now we can define those requirements, and I'll get a little bit today into, we don't have too much time, let's get a little bit today into the means by which you can define those standards. But there's more than just defining the standards. You actually need to get the teams to use them. Just like you can't go and define the APIs for teams and throw the APIs on them, you can't force teams to go by standards. What I've learned in practice is that you have to get the teams to want to go this route, to have API consistency. You can basically make your APIs higher quality by making it easier for all the teams to build APIs, as long as they build APIs according to your standard. And we're getting to tips and tricks as to how to do that. And then finally, one thing to really highlight is the need for these teams to still be in communication, work together, and more importantly, be ready to share plans for APIs. By working together in practice, your APIs will be more consistent. So these are the 3 principles, but it's easier said than done. Let's first talk about getting that API standard going. And I don't want to get too much into this because we only have so much time today. We want to focus more on tooling. But I'll take a moment just to talk about the need for an API council. Basically, just as you can't have one team defining all the APIs to your company at that point, you can't have one team just unilaterally declaring what the API standard should be. API councils traditionally have some sort of representation of engineers, engineering managers, and product managers from any team that's working on a public API. So they all have some say in what the standard ultimately is going to be, and you'll have to work with them and facilitate an API standard. So whatever rules you establish in, say, endpoint definitions, casing, making sure to only use, say, camel case for your endpoints, and snake case for your query parameters, and having specific naming requirements, requirements for strong typing. You can establish all this in the council by initiating discussions and allowing all the teams to provide their feedback, and then establishing the standard in a manner that everyone can still say that they had a say in what the standard's going to be. And once you establish a standard, we can get some fun tools to really help to enforce the standard, or as I prefer to say, not really enforce, but to make it easier for everyone to build APIs along with that standard. The big one being the linter. I'd say the linter really is the biggest component to supporting your API standard. It's basically going beyond the open API schema. When you have open API, you can automatically warn developers that their API designs aren't exactly aligned to the general open API standard. What if we can take our additional standards or additional requirements set in the council and automatically give a warning or an error if you're not abiding by them? Check to see if your query parameters are in snake case. Check to see if certain properties are visibly not strongly typed. Well, the linter is basically extending that validator. Those tools that check to make sure you have a valid API schema, they can check to make sure you're meeting any additional checks that we want to have. It's a nice way of checking, hey, automatically, are you going by our standards? And these fit in very nicely within CI/CD, within the general pipeline on 2 areas. First, if you're planning a whole new set of APIs, maybe you're using an API editor tool like from Swagger Hub, or my personal favorite, Stoplight, a tool that helps you to edit and design your open API schema. The linter can actually be baked into these products and basically warn you as you're designing your API, before you build any of it, that your API is not meeting in some way the standard established by the API Council. So this fits nicely in API designer tools, but also can fit right into the CI/CD pipeline. So if you're working with an existing API, you've just added a new endpoint, or you've added some additional optional parameters, well, maybe you've just coded, you haven't worked on the designer, but before that goes live, the linter tool, if applied properly, can just automatically catch and give an error and block, or at least warn developers they need to make a change to their plan before taking the API live. So this is helping teams to plan and to make sure they don't make accidental mistakes in the release of their APIs. It makes the flow easier while also directing you to design your APIs according to the standard. I'm also a big supporter, as we mentioned, the topic of sharing. And so the linter is a big tool, but I really have to say that the most important component is the reusability of the model definitions in your API. Most of our API endpoints are just built around the underlying models in our API schemas. And the biggest risk is that you wind up with a few slightly different API models for very similar but slightly different purposes on different teams. And next thing you know, a developer can use the output of the APIs of one product with the inputs of the API of another product. So really the biggest thing to ensure consistency is to encourage teams to reuse models rather than always define their own. And this can be done by supporting sharing. It's also aided through API designer tools like Swagger Hub and Stoplight, where if teams start to establish certain models that they're using, you can create a central schema of these reusable models and provide an auto-suggest method so that other teams that are planning their API, well, they can see the models that are already in use and just grab one of those before they even try planning a new model. It's making it much easier to plan and implement your API by reusing existing models, and inherently, it makes your APIs more consistent. So I find this can also be done through API editors, like what Stoplight has, what Swagger has, or Insomnia, it's owned by Kong. Combining that with the validator, we can even get creative here and have your validator check, hey, did you simulate, are you releasing a new API with an entirely new model? Let's go and take a look and see if this model is similar to any models we've already established within our standard. And we can alert you that maybe you shouldn't make a new model, you should use an existing model. So this is the magic of the API editor tool, sharing models, and then using that validator, applying a linter and other checks to make sure these APIs are meeting your standard. Now, I have to warn, if you're using these sort of tools, you're establishing your standard, you're enforcing your standard, just be prepared for surprises in the design when you're bringing these things into your CI/CD pipeline. Here's the fun thing to be ready for. It is very common to establish standards, and so we also want to be consistent in our API documentation and our SDKs, and maybe have one centralized team that's facilitating the standards, but then also maintaining that developer site with your documentation, and they're generating the SDKs for you. Now, you'll find that even if the APIs are properly designed according to Open API schema, they're properly designed according to any standards you've established and enforced in a linter, that schema may be totally valid, but suddenly it's not working with your documentation generator, or you're trying to generate code samples or code libraries, and that's not working either. I find it's very common for teams now to use CodeGen or a modified version of CodeGen to generate API libraries. But CodeGen doesn't take any valid Open API schema and generate your library. It has certain little kinks in it, certain extra requirements that you need to be aware of. And you may have to apply that in your linter and your validator and make sure that teams are not just providing a valid API schema, but a schema that is going to work with any down the pipeline tooling when you're creating documentation SDKs. I find it's important to actually communicate it to teams. We're having a general requirement of an Open API schema, Open API standard. We have additional standard requirements to keep our APIs aligned. We have this requirement to please use existing models as much as possible. And we have some extra things you have to put in your definition to make sure that when we're generating the documentation for you, it's going to actually work. So in theory, you can make this very nice, smooth pipeline that enforces everything and still automatically generates your documentation, your libraries. But in practice, you have to be ready for some caveats. It's totally resolvable. Just be ready for them. All right, I'm going to try rushing through the last bits here, but ultimately, you can't talk about tooling without talking about an API gateway. Another common challenge we have when it comes to API standardization is allowing basically, if you let teams have their own infrastructure, you may find that even if each of them is setting up rate limiting and proper enforcement of rate limiting, developers can get around it. You may have a problem with a malicious developer utilizing the fact that you have different infrastructure for different APIs, and rate limiting won't be that easy to enforce unless you have common infrastructure. So I strongly encourage teams to establish an agreement on what API gateway to use. If everyone's on the same API gateway, it's much easier to enforce rate limiting across all your APIs. It's also a lot easier to have analytics set up. I've encountered many situations where your data team, your analytics team, has to create a custom system for API monitoring and data collection for each API. It's a lot more work, and it's a lot less reliable than if you have everyone on the same infrastructure, under the same gateway, utilizing the same built-in or third-party analytics tools or data monitoring tools that just work across the board. It makes it much more likely to just work out of the box, work more reliably, and with much less effort. So I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A here. But besides just talking about how with these sort of tools, applying the principles of a standard through the council and setting up a linter to enforce your standards and all the tooling around automation here, what does the future hold as we continue to grow and as we continue to try to make this whole thing smoother for your teams to build even better APIs? I'd say keep a lookout for what's in the market, check some interesting open source solutions, and think out of the box yourself. For instance, I found the Swagger Inflector tool. It helps teams that maybe didn't define their APIs strongly to give them a head start by auto-generating a new version of their open API schema with strongly typed formatting. They can detect, oh, do you have an ID? Okay, well, let's make it, a string of UUID format. They can detect if something should be in date time format and try to strongly type it for you. So just extra creative tools like that. I found a tool, Open API diff, that helps to automatically catch, based on the differences in your open API schema, is there a breaking change? So keep a lookout for these tools you can incorporate into your CI/CD pipeline to better ensure the quality across all the teams working on your API. And also, when it comes to defining your linter to really enforce your standards, I do find there's a bit of a hurdle here in understanding how to create that in a schema. Can we make that easier? It turned out Stoplight already was one step ahead. They've created an interface. You can actually have like a linter builder that'll help you to enforce through an interface. They can help you to create the actual enforcement policies to share within your pipeline. So I'm trying to rush through the last bits here. So I will just emphasize for everyone, set your standards, work across your teams, make this, it's very late by me, I forgot the term, but don't dictate. Try to create a system by which everyone has their say, facilitate, but through these tools, you can keep coordinated and keep an automated system for consistent, well-designed APIs. All right, I definitely hit a limit here, so thank you for your patience. And if there are any questions here, I think we have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jeremy. So we still have 2 minutes, and I actually see a comment. He asked twice about what is your thought about the JSPSO API mandate. So do you have any supplement to add? I think this is a very popular one. So do you have any supplement to add?
Sorry, I couldn't hear all that. Sorry, can you repeat that?
Okay. So there's an audience asking, what is your thoughts about the famous JSPSO's API mandate, talking about everything should be going through the API interface. Do you have any supplement, because your content is very relevant to that? Yeah.
Yes. So I do see it as a slightly different topic, but is one that I support. Jeff Bezos, I think, is more the APIs first principles. That's like everything we build should be built on top of APIs. Overall, I think it's a good thing, but it's not everything. I've seen companies that are APIs first, eat your own dog food, they apply RESTful design principles, and yet their APIs actually end up not being a fit for their developer community, because there is a difference between APIs first and design first. They go together, but just because your APIs first doesn't mean you're design first. And so I have other talks on that topic. This talk really assumed that you're applying ideally APIs first, but to me, most importantly, regardless, design first principles. Where you're designing, you're making sure that your APIs are designed according to validated use cases of what developers in the external community are actually trying to do.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for your response to the audience. So I think the time is almost up. So thanks once again for your sharing. So thanks for your support to Apidays HongKong. Okay, see you soon. Thank you.